Hey everyone, time to get started with East Asia. Like I said last time when we talked about South Asia, and India seemed to dominate that conversation, being the largest country in that region in terms of population and in general geographic size. China is probably going to dominate this conversation for the very same reasons. Again, being largest country in the world in terms of population and quite large in terms of its geographic size as well. So without further ado, we'll jump in and discuss the countries. What sort of makes this a region in terms of East Asia now, coming from South Asia. We know South Asia was part of the Indian subcontinent from that tectonic plate that crashed into the Eurasian continent and largest continent in the world. And it smashed into there some 60 million years ago. And that then leaves us with why that was South Asia. Now here we have 1/5 of the world's population here in this area, dominated, of course, like I said, by China. About 1.4 billion people, billion, massive country in terms of its population and size, and again, also quite geographically large. Again, it's made of 6 countries, the 2 Koreas on the Korean Peninsula, North and South, Japan, Taiwan, China, and Mongolia. East Asia, it's the furthest east we can go on the Asian continent. So it's kind of self-explanatory of why we're going to refer to this as East Asia. Now here's a political map of, one that gives us a little bit more detail. And it's kind of important to lay out where the population is and where we're going to sort of be discussing most of our trajectory in terms of when we discuss our humans. But of course, we'll be talking about the physical geography first, but not without discussing this map. You can see not much sort of going on here with city development out in western part of China, western part of East Asia. So you're going to move in the western direction. Mongolia, not any sort of major key cities there other than their capital. Again, you can see that North and South Korea only designated by their capital cities. You can see they're not too far apart in terms of the proximity, and we know that we're going to be discussing the relationship between North and South Korea, and particularly North and South Korea to other actors in the region, and of course very timely, more abroad, and Japan. You see some important coastal cities there. Okinawa, we have a military base there. The United States has some influence there, and our relationship with Japan we'll obviously be discussing. But take a sort of an important look of these coastal cities in in China, and again, some of the more infamous cities, some of the more important cities we'll be realizing are in the easternmost portion of China, and again, proximity to the coast, and we'll be discussing the physical properties, landforms, and of course climate, and that's going to give it away of why they are certainly there. So of course, part 1 will bring us to the physical geography. Some landforms to note. I'm going to throw it in the reversed order this time, where we talk about the landforms in terms of seeing their names on the text, and then we're going to go and look for them on the map. Himalayas, again, from South Asia, are going to be working their way back in because they're still a major landform for this particular region as well. The Tibetan Plateau, a quite large geographic feature or landform in this region. We have 3 main rivers, and you're going to see them in their different designations in the text. The Yellow, the Yangtze, and the Mekong rivers. East China Sea and the South China Sea, again, also important for some geopolitical reasons, happening right now in a very timely way with China in this characteristic of landforms. The islands of Japan, 5 main islands of Japan that we'll come to know, and the Korean Peninsula. Of course, Korea separated into North and South Korea, and we probably know a little bit about that story and history. And if you don't already, tune in for the next video when we talk about human patterns and what sort of happened there some years ago. Now we talk about the landforms, and now that we see these, we're going to go look for them. Not necessarily all of them, but the Himalayan mountains, if you remember, we talked about India, Nepal, and Bhutan. There was that Himalayan region. Of course, the Himalayan mountains still where they are. They didn't move. 29,035 feet. Remember that. World's tallest point from sea level, located here. And as you can see, when that landmass pushed up, the Indian subcontinent pushed up, created these mountains, and there's a large plateau, giving it away, the Tibetan Plateau situated here. You can see there's some basins and low-lying areas, of course, on the coast. As we see most of our low-lying areas situated near the coast, it's going to be, again, important of why we see these low-lying areas located in the easternmost portion of China, near the water, and again, most hospitable for agricultural production and overall hospitable for human development and living. We'll see, again, Japan, it has some elevation there. We'll talk about Mount Fuji and the mountainous regions of Japan as well in terms of their volcanic islands in the archipelago of Japan, the 5 main islands. The Korean Peninsula is a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides. Definition of a peninsula, that geographic term coming back from chapter 1. Mongolia here, the Gobi Desert located here in this area. Again, reason why we're not seeing a lot of development going on in that area. And again, some mountainous areas, again, sort of situating why we see a lot of the development here in southeastern China. And again, it's going to be a look for, table that idea of why we see the development again here and not so much here when we talk about climate as well. Landforms, the Taklamakan Desert, which would be out here in this area. Again, low-lying, but an area where we talk about why this is influenced in the way that it is. If you remember back when we talk about wind and atmospheric and oceanic patterns of why that influences temperature and climate and landforms, and we know the further we move inward into a continent, the more variability we see in temperature. And that's the case here. We talked about that in Siberia and Russia. We talked about that huge landmass and how you could see, and we talked about it actually in the United States too. So a more local example, local-ish, would be like we said in the Dakotas, where they would have some hot summers and some very, very cold winters, and that variation would take place because it's quite far away from the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. The same case would be said in Russia, and we're just moving a bit further south now from Siberia. When we move into Asia now, that being, well, no, Russia is partly in Asia, but we'll talk about more Asia proper in the sense of now in East Asia, and this is no different when we see this area quite far from the Pacific Ocean. When we move ourselves in this area, and again, partly in this area, in Western East Asia is the farthest from any ocean coastline that you see at any point in the world. And so you see these variations existing in terms of temperature at the utmost in the East Asian region. We talked about Okinawa, Japan, the Kenting National Park in Taiwan. You can see this sort of beach. You look at the southernmost point in Taiwan. Again, Taiwan is an island located about 100 miles off the coast of China. We know that that's about the same distance of Cuba, located off the coast of Florida, Miami, Florida, and Florida. And so we can understand that relationship a little bit better when you think of that geographic proximity. The Yellow River, located there, sort of meandering there in a horseshoe way. Talked about the desert and the 5 main islands of Japan. I think that's something that you should know. Again, we talked about Okinawa, seen here, and seen in another image, but the largest being Honshu. Important to know, but again, just know these 5 main islands of Japan. Again, more than 5 islands, but those are the main ones. Now getting us to the climate. And we're going to talk about it in 3 main areas like the book does. We're using it as a guide. The dry interior, the monsoon east, and natural hazards. Well, natural hazards isn't a geographic area like the first 2 are, but we're going to need to talk about natural hazards in this region. So skipping back, we see, again, all of this development here. We see it's green. What we see when that's green in an elevation, we don't have a legend here, so that's not exactly ideal, but we see this area certainly being a highland region. It's a plateau. Mountains here and here, a little bit here. But again, low-lying coastal areas here, which does be favorable for agriculture. But not only that, because it's not mountainous, but again, humid subtropical. So this is, again, the most favorable climate type for agriculture and for human development in the East Asian region. When we know what humid subtropical is like, when we talked about this in parts of India, when we talked about it in parts of southeastern Brazil, southeastern United States, we're in southeastern United States and Florida, and we're going to see this is that monsoon east where we have to deal with the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Again, we talked about that literally in more regions than not, and that's going to influence the climatic factors that go to play and how it influences rainfall patterns in East Asia. And so we see not only is this area low-lying, it's coastal, but again, it is our most favorable area in terms of precipitation when we discuss East Asia. Humid continental, we would think of this area as, again, also quite favorable, if you will. Again, favorable being a relatively speaking, but humid continental would be areas like we'd see in the northeastern United States or the Midwest in certain parts. Again, we're just overgeneralizing this, but if you think of some of these areas like that for a more at-home example, as one that you might be a little bit more familiar with. Again, these areas, if you'd look at it in terms of their latitude, they are moving in, to be quite north in relation to the southeast part of East Asia. But again, these areas would be a little bit more favorable. You see a lot of rainfall taking place in humid subtropical area and tropical rainforests that you'd see in parts of southeast China and the island of Taiwan. So again, very favorable in terms of rainfall and what you can obviously do when you have rainfall present in your environment. Areas that aren't so hospitable and a little bit more tricky to find a way of life that's quite suitable for humans would be that in the desert and steppe region, and certainly the highlands. And because of that Tibetan plateau, if we remember through here, we have the Himalayan mountains and that huge elevation in terms of a plateau. That there is the Tibetan plateau, which leads us to a highland climate. Again, a little bit of rough living there, which is why we don't see all the development like we see out here. So in summation, we'll see this entire area, actually, the entire western half, majority actually of the western, majority of this region in general, but the western half of East Asia is not really hospitable for human development as we know it. This is subarctic up here, because we're getting into the same areas what we described as Siberia. And so we have highland here, subarctic, desert and steppe, and which is why we see that development pushed to the coast, which again goes back to favorable for agriculture, favorable for trading and coastal transportation and all the like. Again, this southeast part of East Asia, again, part of South Korea and Japan, and it's actually kind of be quite important when we talk about agriculture. So the dry interior here, the interior part of the continent, dry interior, and the monsoon east, specifically this corridor right here. Now, natural hazards, that brings us to discuss typhoons, which are like our hurricanes, if you will, that would be taking place here. There's tsunamis that can take place, triggered and or not by earthquakes. And so we know about earthquakes in this area because this is the Pacific Rim of Fire, the Pacific Ring of Fire in the Pacific Rim. We know this area because of a high volcanic activity, like we go back to our first chapter in explorations. A lot of volcanic activity taking place here. So there's a lot of earthquakes. Majority of the world's earthquakes and volcanoes taking place in this area in the Ring of Fire. And so we know that this area can spring tsunamis or sea waves, tidal waves, and it brings tsunamis, which are the equivalent of our hurricanes, and of course earthquakes and volcanic activity. And so again, this area pretty prime for natural disasters. Now the environment, and it's going to talk about climate change vulnerability just like we did in South Asia, because in that regard it's not too different. When we talk about glacial melting, again, these areas where these rivers are beginning their origins, being up in more mountainous areas where snow and ice pack and glaciers are present, and they melt down and they form these natural rivers. We know that the ice is melting at a rate that is alarming and that is not sustainable, and those river systems will likely dry up to some extent, whether it be completely gone or at least certainly less and less than what these folks have been accustomed to over the last millennia. And we know that that produces flooding in the interim because a lot more water is flowing down in its way in some places. And then we know the long-term effect of that would certainly be droughts and concerns for water shortages, which brings us to our next water shortages. Droughts by far are the most significant natural disaster in this area when we talk about suffering and impact, because droughts and water shortages are present in East Asia at any given time. Further, when we talk about folks that are trying to establish agricultural practices in areas that aren't totally conducive for agriculture, they're taking the brush away, the vegetation, they're trying to farm there. We know that that leads to desertification, it disturbs the soils. In some places, when there's not a lot of vegetation left, it allows for wind to carry soil away and take it down to soil that's no longer suitable for productive agriculture. And so these, again, climate change vulnerability exacerbated, made worse by human activity, of course, when we talk about desertification and water shortages. Natural disasters we've touched on. We talk about, sort of tsunamis and waves, earthquakes and things like that. There's been some years of high activity in terms of a lot of deaths that have taken place. They mentioned the Sendai earthquake that produced the Fukushima meltdown in Japan. They were sort of trending upward for the amount of nuclear energy that they sought out in East Asia. That certainly was halted after that disaster and meltdown. Obviously scared folks. So back away there, just as sort of a timely issue. But again, that sort of a natural disaster, natural hazards influence these other things as well. So in some areas, the water table is depleting by 3 feet per year in parts of China due to agriculture and irrigation is being pulled away because they're trying to farm places that might not quite look like this. This doesn't inspire much confidence if we're left to have to farm this, of course. But areas that, of course, that aren't as conducive for agriculture, that's certainly not as far gone as whatever we want to call that. But northern China produces 60% of their wheat, 45% of their corn, and 35% of their cotton. And so this area, again, has to pull some significant water resources. We know the world's largest use of fresh water in the world is for irrigation, and that's, again, a significant issue for China and East Asia. Brings us to food security, because I just started to talk about food. We know it's not totally uncommon. It's just some traditional food here. See some, looks like some ginseng root, some green onions. I don't know what. A little fan in case you get too hot from eating your food. Chopsticks, of course. Looks like some traditional bowls and such. A lot of whatever that is, bamboo or something. But yeah, looks traditional. We know demand for meat is happening. At one point, Japan was the largest consumer and producer of fish. I think we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that in a second, lightly. So we're not going to talk about it at this slide. I will talk about it, meat in general, sort of a more traditional sense of the meat when we talk about like beef and pork and chicken. We know when a society increases its affluence, when a society becomes richer, a country becomes richer, or a people becomes richer, there's a demand for more meat because of its population can afford it. And because wages are increasing throughout China and East Asia, specifically those that are in more of a democratic society, specifically Japan, South Korea, and of course China, not so much in the sort of the democratic sense, but in terms of wages rising and the demand for meat certainly taking place in East Asia and China and the like. And so that is, of course, putting a different kind of burden on agriculture. Animals need feed. China and a lot of China was largely self-sufficient in some of its food production, but again, calling for more of this, more soybeans, more corn, more wheat, and things for animal feed produced for meat and to produce for vegetables for the human population. Again, it gets a little bit more complicated when you're certainly running out of room due to urban sprawl, sprawling out of all these large cities, especially on the coast. If you remember, this is the area where they need to farm because this is the area that's most conducive for agriculture. Conversely, it's the area where people want to live, where the cities are, and where growth is expanding. And so that's certainly putting a constraint on the resources in these localized areas. So 75% of food consumed in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan is imported. U.S. being the largest importer of food in the world, and you got China and Japan as at the 2 and 3 spot. Only slightly more than half of the land in East Asia is suitable for agriculture. We can go back our way here. Again, we're talking about this area largely. This area, not so great. So not really a total surprise there. So that talks about the sustainability of agriculture in East Asia and the food security then in relation to that. This is, some food production now. Rice cultivation, specifically the book talks about wet rice cultivation, where, they have to dabble a little bit more with the water resources that go into rice. That's a water-intensive agricultural product. And human environmental impacts, of course, there that go into rice cultivation. Again, a major staple of East Asian food sources. Now we talk about fishing and overfishing. Now China nowadays produces the most fish in the world, and they're doing that mostly through the production of ponds and in a commercial way, done through holding ponds in a commercial industrial way. And it's not the traditional fishing sense that we had seen over the years. And this is something that's a general trend in the developed world. Fishing, going out in boats in the deep sea, not necessarily taking place in that traditional way to the same extent as it has done in the past, where a lot of places are producing shrimp and different fish in constructed ponds and in a more commercialized way, like we see with our large agriculture, like we would have other traditional things like beef and corn and what have you. But overfishing is something that was talked about in Jiro Dreams of Sushi from Japan. Overfishing, the Japanese have been accused of overfishing for quite some time. Go out about 200 nautical miles from the coastlines. They're in international waters, sort of more of a rush or race to the resources at that point. And of course, they're not just sticking in and around their area, they're moving around the world. There's been accusations that they're fishing off of places off of Africa, which is causing the fishery, the local fishers there to not have as much resources and have to seek work elsewhere. And so this is sort of a major problem because when overfishing takes place, the natural order is disturbed when fish can simply not reproduce at the rate that they're being taken out of the oceans and the seas. It talks about sort of native or just different animal species that have some place in their society, and sheep, goats, and yaks in East Asia, specifically the western part of East Asia, and specifically Mongolia when we think of yaks, a long-haired bovine creature as the book puts it. But they have their place for that nomadic lifestyle that's taking place largely and traditionally in places like Mongolia and western China. And then koi or carp and that are largely ornamental and used for aesthetic purposes in gardens and other places, can be quite large in places like Japan. So that sort of just wraps up that section on food security and sustainability and animals in a different sense, not just necessarily for consumption, but for other purposes as well. Three Gorges Dam makes its note in the environmental section of the book. It is the largest in the world to date, 600 feet tall in places and 1.4 miles wide, so 183 meters tall. It does produce a large amount of hydroelectricity for the Chinese. This is on the Yangtze River in China. There's a lot of ecological ramifications. This comes at a cost. It's displaced upwards of 60 million people, according to some researchers and environmentalists. We worry about it. Not me personally. I don't sit up at night worrying about it. Although maybe now I will. But some worry about its structural integrity. There's cracks and things like that. And some smaller dams have broken at times and have killed in the hundreds of thousands of people in China before, whether due to drought and famine as a result or simply because of flooding. And so there's obviously concern as the world's largest dam may have some issues as well, and also in a lesser extent disease. And so these are some of the associated risks with the Three Gorges Dam. Air pollution, and that'll be the last slide for our physical and environmental aspect of East Asia. But China accounts for 47% of all the world's production of coal burned, or of coal burned globally, 40%, so about half of the world's coal that's being burned coming from China. As a result of all this industry and coal burning and things like we saw in the United States rapidly, decades ago, still taking place, of course, but not to that large extent as it is now, leads to acid rain. Again, also because of that area in the southeastern part where we see that humid subtropical climate, acid rain and air pollution and pollution in general. We know that this is the second worst region that we'll cover in terms of pollution, air pollution and pollution in general. We talked about that when we talked about the worst region being South Asia just moments ago when we were speaking specifically about India and other places like that in South Asia. To show you how much factories that are taking place here and how many cars. We know that Taiwan is a small island 100 miles off the coast of China, and that there's 21.5 million cars in Taiwan alone. And that doesn't even begin to talk about what's in China and other places. So we know that the emissions that take place as a result are quite negative for the human population there, and there's obviously changes needed to take place to support a cleaner environment. So that wraps up part 1 of East Asia, and we'll get ready to click on part 2 coming up for human interactions and human processes.